Hi, I'm Toby Ord here at the Faculty of Philosophy, and within this program on the population ethics theory and practice, as are in fact all of these people here. So I want to talk here about what's the ideal population. So when talking about population, a lot of people talk about overpopulation as kind of as an umbrella for the name of the area of population policy, or thinking about that as the big problem. What I want to think about, though, is how to pick the ideal size of the population. And thus, overpopulation is kind of one end of that. If there were too many people, if there were too few people, it would be underpopulation. Some of you might think that's very implausible that we're currently in a situation of underpopulation. I think it's somewhat plausible, as you'll see. But you could instead imagine, would it be good to have 5 people in the world? I think 5 people would be pretty clearly underpopulated, as in it would definitely be better to have more than 5 people. Maybe it would be better to have, suppose Britain were populated as it is at the moment and everything else was empty, of humans at least. I think actually it'd be better to have more than that as well. So at least you can think about it as this question of what would it mean for it to be better to have more people or fewer people? So that's what I'm going to be talking about. As I said, we generally think and hear about negatives of population. Here is Malthus's pamphlet and Ehrlich's book. And there's a lot of worry about overpopulation. But what I want to be looking at is how to actually find what's the ideal level of population. When I was originally giving this talk, I was told to be controversial if possible, so what I'm trying to do here is to remove the controversial if possible aspect of this, though, and try to actually just answer this question, find out what we really think. So population isn't just a negative. And I'm going to show you ways in which this can be the case. It can also bring many benefits, and what I want to talk about is these benefits. Many people talk about the costs of population. There are many costs, they're real. I don't deny that at all. But I do think there are many benefits, and there's relatively little attempt to see how the benefits weigh against the costs in order to work out how to balance this, ideally. And there may be an imperative to limit population if we have too many people at the moment, or if we're very soon going to have too many people. There could also be an imperative to increase population. You could at least imagine that in other worlds, even if not at the moment. For example, it might be the case if we continue on with Western-style birth rates for a while. If we have birth rates of kind of 1.2 children per woman for a couple of centuries, then maybe we'll be in a situation where we really need to increase population. And how do the benefits and costs weigh up in practice? So I'm going to divide this into looking at 2 different aspects, which I call, as a philosopher, instrumental value and intrinsic value. The instrumental value is the idea as to how does... so if something has instrumental value, if it produces value through its effect on other things. So a person could have instrumental value if they add value to other people. So perhaps if you have a child, that could increase the value in the life of the parents or other people in society. So the first thing I'm going to look at here is what economists call information goods. And I've got an example here of a physical good, and here an information good, hammers versus songs. And I want to show a few differences here. So hammers are made from matter. Songs are fundamentally just a pattern. So it can be represented, as the surface of a record, or represented as magnetic patterns on a disc. Hammers, each one must be laboriously made, whereas for songs, they must be laboriously made once and then can be very cheaply copied, and that's the principal difference. Hammers benefit the one person who desires it. So someone makes it, and then one person gets to use it. Songs benefit all people who desire them. So one person writes and records a song, and then potentially billions of people can get the benefit from it. And these scale in very different ways and have different effects on the benefits of population. The value is independent of population for hammers. If you have 1 billion people, you need 1 billion times as many hammers as if you have one person. And you need to make all of those hammers. There are some minor benefits of scale due to producing a big factory, but they're not that big. Whereas with songs, they get more valuable the more people there are to enjoy them. So increasingly many goods are in the information economy. So examples include novels, poems, films, songs, recipes. So there's some cultural ones. Science, inventions, designs. Software is a big one these days. All academic research. So these are some examples of information goods. They include a lot of things. And these are things that, that the more people there are, the more people are to benefit from them. And this has some interesting effects. So, for example, if you doubled the size of the population, then we could get the same amount of each of those things and have more free time if we wanted to. So all the people who are producing information goods could work half as long, and we could have a lot more leisure and produce the same amount of these information goods. So that's the type of thing that can happen if you had more people, is that you wouldn't have to spend as long producing these things to get the same amount. Alternatively, you could produce even more of them. It's less clear what happens in that case because it's presumably diminishing marginal returns on some of these types of research. So you could get the benefit in either of those two forms. So that's the type of benefit of having more people. Obviously it has to be weighed against costs, but you need to know what the benefits are in order to weigh them. And another way to look at this is to think the other way around. With a smaller population, suppose we'd had a smaller population over the last couple of thousand years. Suppose our population had been half the size for the last 2,000 years. We would have inferior technology, which means that we would have lower lifespans and things due to having worse health technologies. We would have inferior science, social science and humanities now. We'd have fewer great artistic works, or alternatively, the peak artistic works would be of lower quality, another way of saying the same thing. And we'd have less cultural diversity than we have at the moment. So there are a few of the costs that we would have had if we decided to have a smaller population. Okay, another example, I'll go quickly on this one, is complex goods. Computers are an example of a complex good. Instead of just being made of iron, they're made from a long list of exotic elements and components. They're made in very complex factories, and you require a huge population in order to be able to make computers. If we had 100,000 people in the world, we could not have computers. I don't know how many people you'd need to have computers. There are some economists who look at this type of thing, but I'm not familiar with it. But there are these types of goods that, because they require so many different subcomponents, you require all kinds of exotic rare earths to be mined and things like that. I mean, for a particular rare earth to be mined, you must require millions of people just to get to that point. So if we had smaller populations, potentially it would be impossible to get some of these complex goods. But I would like to know a bit more about that before I put much weight on that, to know, are there many complex goods that you really need more than 1 billion people to have? Maybe you could get computers with 1 billion people, so the argument's not that relevant. I'm not really sure. It could be that if we had larger populations, there'd be newer types of goods that we have difficulty imagining in the same way that people in the past would have difficulty imagining computers. Either way, we get these goods now because of the population. Perhaps it would just take a lot longer if we had a smaller population. Well, that's somewhat hard to believe still, without a command economy. Otherwise, why would people produce small parts of computers for thousands of years so that eventually someone could assemble one? It seems unlikely people would do that just with markets. And then finally, I want to look at intrinsic value. So the idea here is that another way that we've looked at two different ways in which higher populations could have value through the effects they have on the existing people. So if we add more people, those people can do academic research, they can invent things, they can discover new science, they can write music that the other people can listen to and so on, and produce a lot of benefits. And the larger the population, you get more of these instrumental benefits. There are also potentially the intrinsic value of these people themselves. So, one point is that your population too. Is it good that you exist? Ignoring the effects that you have on others. At least if I reflect on this, my life feels very good for me, and I think it's better for the world to have each of us in it. Setting aside our negative effects we have on others, for example. So if it was the case that we create a new person and they pollute a bit, or use up resources in various ways, they could have negative effects on others. But it also seems that there is something positive about just having them in and of themselves. Another example is this one. What would we miss out on if we had a billion fewer people? So some people talk about the idea that maybe we should lower the population on the Earth by about 1 billion. So what does that mean? Well, one example is the current British population is 0.06 billion people. The entire population who have ever lived in Britain from prehistoric times onwards is less than 1 billion. It's not all that much less. I ran some numbers on this. It's quite hard to work out the exact numbers of people who've ever lived in these islands, but it's somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion. And was there something good about having all of this life and activity people have strived for over these many centuries here? Seems to me that the world would be poorer in terms of value if that hadn't existed. That there is intrinsic value in having all of this flourishing of civilization, even ignoring the effects that the people who lived here had on other parts of the world. Should we, I said here, should we blithely give up things of this magnitude? Maybe blithely was designed for the slightly more controversial version. But at least it's something that seems like it's of value, and we should think about that value and try to work out whether the costs outweigh those benefits, rather than just ignoring those benefits. There's this big question about how we should measure the intrinsic value of people. I've given a couple of sketches to try to motivate the idea that there is some intrinsic value in having people. And we'd often think this if we have a child, that there's some value in that child's life. But how do you measure this? Theron's going to be talking about this in some more detail, but we could ask, if there's value in the lives of my family members, is there twice as much value in two families? Maybe. You don't have to agree with that. Are there diminishing returns to the value of people? Is adding, the billionth person have diminishing returns in terms of the intrinsic value compared to the person before that? Should we take an average? Something more complicated? There are a lot of answers in the population ethics area with the something more complicated section. Well, I'm not going to weigh in on that here, but there are many options here for how to deal with this intrinsic value. It's not obvious how to deal with it. So, in conclusion, questions about population targets are very serious. Would require us to think seriously and soberly about all of the benefits and costs. We have to think about the benefits as well as the costs. There's been very little serious attempts to do so, as well as relatively few attempts to balance the benefits and costs. There have been very few attempts to even catalogue the benefits and say what they might be in order to even begin the task. So while we might think that quantitatively doing it would border on the impossible, there hasn't even been an attempt to qualitatively list what the benefits are, let alone to compare them against the costs. And I outlined 3 reasons to have higher populations: information goods and complex goods, giving instrumental reasons, and the intrinsic value of the extra people as well. But there's also many reasons to have lower populations. The costs of high populations are familiar to all of us, I think. And my current guess is that we do face overpopulation rather than underpopulation, that we probably have too many people rather than too few. But I'm not sure. And I think it would be very useful to try to work out what's the ideal population, to work out what that even means and how we proceed. Okay, so I have a little bit more I could talk about, but I want to just move into questions and then see what people think and try to clarify in case I've said something that sounds much stronger than what I actually think. And then I can show a few more slides if we have time.
Thanks. So I'm the nominal chair of the session, but I guess there aren't that many of us, so we can probably just have a bit of a free-flowing discussion. But should we start off by raising a hand for any questions for Toby?
Well, a couple of points I would challenge, and the first one was cultural diversity. There will be less cultural diversity with a smaller population. Actually, what we're seeing is a homogenization of cultural diversity because of complex technology across the whole world. And 100 years ago, there was vastly more cultural diversity, vastly more around the world. So that's one. And the other one is The question, is it good that I exist? And if so, yes, from my point of view, of course it's fine, but if my parents had stopped at one rather than having 2 children, I would never have existed. And in the same way with my stepdaughter-in-law, who has 8 children, and thinks that I am vicious and horrible for having any ideas that this might be a bad idea, extremely wealthy and high-consuming Californians, carbon footprint of about a small Bangladeshi town. The answer is, I keep saying, but of course your 8 children are lovely and they were brought up and I love them all dearly, but how much do you grieve for the non-existence of your 9th, 10th, 11th and 12th children? People who never exist do not have no value. Had I never existed, nobody would miss me. So there's a kind of chicken and egg situation there, which I think you haven't resolved.
I definitely haven't resolved it. It's reasonably difficult to resolve. I think, I'm not sure if any of our talks talk about that explicitly, but let's start with the empirical one. So to do with cultural diversity. So it's a very good point that cultural diversity, at least in some senses, has been going down. So I think that there's a nice way to put this, is that the global diversity has been going down. The local diversity has been going up, I think. So what's happened is that you don't have to go to Paris to have good French food anymore, whereas presumably in 1800 you did, or if not, then 1600 or something. Whereas now you can get, you definitely wouldn't have in 1600 have got good Bangladeshi food in Oxford, but now you can. So the local kind of cultural diversity has gone up, but then there's less reason to go to Paris or Bangladesh because little parts of it have kind of come here and so on. So there's a couple of interesting trends there to do with increased local diversity, decreased global diversity. I think that some of that is more a matter of time flowing rather than population increasing. So if, suppose we decided to have fewer children 100 years ago, it doesn't strike me that that would be the type of thing which would mean that globalization wouldn't have happened. So I think that that's, it's true that between the two times you're comparing, the population has gone up in the second one and the global diversity has perhaps gone down. But it's not clear that it's the population going up that caused that. However, it is the case that these information goods and information systems have let us communicate much more between different places, sharing things, and that has partly led to some homogenization. So, for example, the Hollywood or the American music industry has, through these information goods, has had a lot of cultural dominance in other parts of the world. And that's something which has been caused by some of these technologies which we couldn't have had with fewer people. But there are also aspects where it seems to me that, one of them is that if we have a larger population, so suppose you had quite a small population, you wouldn't have anywhere near as many musical genres as we have, because they wouldn't be able to appeal to these different subpopulations. It would be so it's general, fairly obvious point. And so if you just have, similarly, if you have a small village, there are far fewer options for a child, who's interested in some different type of music to actually go and pursue it. In general, the larger something is, the more it can kind of sustain a whole lot of different subgenres in literature and also in music and other areas. So I was trying to allude to general overall trends like that, which are fairly kind of obvious. It's a bit less obvious whether they keep being true once you get to 1 billion or 10 billion people, or whether they're only really true up to a small bit. But it seems like the pattern should continue just from kind of first principles. Anyway, so it's a good point. And so then when it comes to the question of value, so you're saying that there is intrinsic value in you, you're existing.
But only because I exist.
Yeah.
I do exist.
So it can be.
I cannot miss my non-existence.
So one thing is to say that that we're not thinking of value just in terms of whether one grieves or one misses someone. It'd be possible for me to say not grieve, for there to be a hermit who no one grieves for, but still they could have misfortunes in their life, or they could have things that go well in their life. And I imagine you weren't, meaning that it all comes from missing someone or grieving for them. But that's a way in which those ideas don't necessarily track value. And it turns out to be difficult to have an idea of value where you say something has value if it exists, but if it doesn't exist, you normally think that if there's no value, that's worse than if there's some value. But you don't want that, because you don't want it to be the case that if there's more people, there's more value, and therefore you should choose that option. And it looks like there are definitely philosophers who've tried to make this work, and these are called person-affecting views, where you try to say, there's some kind of conditional value or something. There is value in you existing, but that we don't need to compare that to no value when we're choosing whether to make you exist or not, and there's different ways to deal with that. I think that I don't find that those views to be all that attractive when you work through the details, but that's not something that I can convince you of now. But it's definitely the type of angle you can take on this, and it's a popular angle with quite a few philosophers. There's a principle which is where people say that we want to make people happy, not make happy people. And there's a slogan form for this, and there's something to that. I think a lot of people find that somewhat compelling.
Well, it's like food aid in the Horn of Africa these days is not feeding hungry people more, it's feeding more hungry people. Similar problem.
Yeah. Okay, next question.
A lot of your discussions seem to be as if you're taking global mean, and population growth might be in a totally different place from where many of these things are.
Yeah, that's
such as the Chinese population growth did not influence the development of computers, but they happened at the same time.
That's right. I was speaking in some very broad brushstrokes, and
that confuses you quite a lot.
So, to some degree, yes. So I was trying to talk about balancing benefits and costs of additional population. I could have phrased it all in terms of optimal population. I think that would have actually somewhat confused things even more, though, because it really matters where the people are. So it could be that the optimum population isn't just a number like, say 5 billion or something, because it instead depends upon where the people are. We know that, for example, people have fewer costs in certain locations compared to others because they pollute a lot less. So it does matter about the distribution as well. So I was trying to at least step within this framework of balancing, because that sounds like it can still deal with the fact that some people might have more or smaller, larger or smaller costs. They could also have kind of larger or smaller benefits on some of these aspects as well. What I was trying to allude to, though, is just some overall principles of scaling, where with the type...
There's a danger of things happening at the same time, and actually you're then saying that computers develop because there's far more people.
No, I wasn't trying to say that. I was trying to say, as it happens, as far as I understand, the people in China are quite important to us having computers at the moment. But I was trying to say with the complex goods that you need a certain size population in order to get them to happen. I think that if we didn't have China, suppose there were 0 people living in the borders of China, I think we'd still have enough people to be able to have computers. However, if there was only Britain, it's not clear to me that we could sustain computers. So I was trying to make that kind of...
aspect, which is the temporal. You didn't think about space and also time and a rapidly changing population. So the temporal domain is very important. And changing either way is a problem. So you can't really just look at one time and say, what is the optimum? There's also, how is that population changing?
I completely agree. I was just trying to do one thing with the talk, but that's right. And there's some really interesting stuff. We had a look through population policies of different countries around the world and have a nice kind of survey document on that. What was interesting was, I think, there were quite a lot that had population policies to do with limiting their population, but I think only one of them actually talked about the size of the population and said that their country's borders could only support so many people. All of the others talked about the rate of growth of the population, where the idea was that if it was growing too quickly, then there were so many children to teach and educate and take through a whole lot of things, non-productive economically at that moment, such that it was very difficult to have economic growth while they had so much population growth. And so they were all talking about the dynamics of it rather than the end point. That's definitely
And
important as
equally
well.
rapidly decreasing raises its problems too.
Yes. I mean, as an example, it's actually, this stuff's quite interesting, thinking about the basic economics of it. So there were various benefits of a sort with like the Black Death and so on. And people talk about this. So one thing that happened with losing, I think, about a third of the population in Britain was that everyone had more land, the people who are still alive. Obviously, it's a little bit illicit if we look at the average person who's alive afterwards and the average person who's alive beforehand, because we're assuming something there about averages being the relevant thing rather than the total. But the average amount of land did increase, which is interesting, and also that meant that people could then farm the better land and didn't have to farm the worse land. So there were various types of benefits like that, but there are also various costs, obviously, from that.
And I was thinking in China too, the problem they have now of actually supporting all this older population with less people to actually, younger people to be productive and make goods.
It's a good example of a dynamic cost, yeah.
Yes.
And where we've got that one ourselves in Britain.
Yeah.
We produced a paper recently called The Depopulation Dividend, actually showing that there's a huge myth about the ageing crisis in this country. Actually, it's just an inevitable transition to a mature civilization, and there are huge benefits, especially for future generations, from having stable and indeed reducing populations.
Okay, what kinds of benefits? What kinds of benefits?
Well, the first one is that if your population is reducing, as it is in Japan and Korea and Germany, where they're getting a bit of a panic about it, you reduce the amount of ecological overshoot, ecological devastation of causing the world by being overpopulated and at the same time over-consuming. The second one is the return of real inheritance. You can hand on, not debt for that you've incurred by building out more infrastructure for ever more people, but completed infrastructure which your children need not pay for. And this is a great advantage to them. There's also the advantage of full employment. All these countries have widespread unemployment. Once the population is stabilised and starts to reduce, employers and governments have interest in investing in skills, and you upgrade. I mean, in this country, for instance, with a very rapidly growing population, employers do not have any competitive advantage in investing in better technology and higher productivity, which we're very bad at, because they have an ever-swelling cheap labour force, and you can get 3 people to do what one machine might know. And so,
okay, that's.
I think about 18 reasons.
Oh, that's fantastic. As I was trying to explain with this kind of talk, the idea was to say, we're at this stage where there's been a lot of focus on negatives because there are very real negatives. In fact, I think it's really admirable how easily in this area people can focus on negative externalities, whereas in general negative externalities are very hard to get people to understand and so on. And it's been very admirably done here. But there's relatively little understanding of the positive externalities, and even getting to the point where one has a list of benefits and drawbacks to even start to kind of get a rough idea of how they compare would be very valuable. And so these types of benefits that you're suggesting for an ageing population, there are obviously drawbacks of an ageing population as well. But these benefits include things that I've never heard talked about before. And so I think it's really useful with the discussion to say, before we prejudge whether it's good or bad to have an ageing population, let's actually have a list, at least a bit of a go at creating lists of both sides.
Part of the intrinsic value of a person is being perceived as valuable by somebody else. Is there any intuition that if there were 5 people on the planet, you would value each of them intrinsically more than you would value the average person if there's 7.3 billion people on the planet? So do we have an intuition that we value pandas more than we value ants, and that distinction is based on their number? Could the same apply so that more humans could actually reduce the extent to which we value each other?
So it's an interesting question, and so people have explored such systems where there's diminishing marginal value of intrinsic value of population. So one thing is you get that very simply if you assume that what's valuable is a species existing, then you get that fairly naturally, because if there's a small number of members of the species, it's more likely to go extinct. So that would be one way that you could say that it's bad that there are so few gorillas at the moment, and that it would be good if there were twice as many gorillas, is just because it changes the probability of gorillas going extinct. And you might think it's unlikely that various species of ants will go extinct or something because there's so many of them. I mean, that's kind of one approach there. It seems to me that people, such as the people in this room, have value above and beyond just that they create some extra chance that humanity will continue. It seems to me that humanity could be better or worse depending on how our lives go and things like that. It's not just a species concept, it's also each of the individual lives. It's important for me to be healthy, not just because it keeps humanity going, but because it makes me happy. But you could take that kind of concept and put it with the numbers and talk about decreasing marginal value. David has a very good series of papers which talk about this, and there's a concept called separability, and this is a kind of an economics concept which is now coming into moral philosophy a bit. And the idea there is that if there are certain questions where we don't need to know, in order to answer one question, we don't need to know the answer to another question. The idea is those are separable. So one example might be that we think that in order to know whether we should have children now, we don't need to know how good lives were in ancient Egypt. And that sounds pretty plausible, but it turns out that if you make assumptions like that, then you end up ruling out the idea that we have decreasing marginal value of extra people, of the intrinsic value. And I refer you to David's paper for the proof. Theron will be talking a little bit about that in his talk as well. But it does turn out that there are some relatively safe-sounding assumptions you can make about this thing over here is not connected to that thing there, and that it ends up with saying that you can't have diminishing value. But it is a plausible view. It just turns out that there's at least one good argument against it. But it turns out also there are good arguments against all of the views in this area. At least fairly good arguments, maybe not decisive.
Could I return to this number of people increasing one's contacts and diversity as you go around? I think we've experienced this. If you live in a village, you know everyone in that village. Mm-hmm. If you live in a big city, you hardly know anyone. Mm-hmm. And so it's a case where actually the more people are, the less rich one's interactions. Well, it's an interesting question. Obviously, we could separate ourselves into having lots of villages rather than cities, or we could ghettoize our cities such that each neighbourhood only talks to itself and doesn't talk to the neighbourhoods next door or something. But it seems that we think it's better not to do that, and that certainly the history of the last few centuries have been histories of increasing urbanisation, of people moving to the cities deliberately. And so it seems like there's something to be said for city life. In fact, just last year, I think we crossed 50% of the population living in cities mark. Well, there is a reason people move there, but it doesn't mean their life is better when they're there. Yeah, that's right. So, I'd avoided saying that exactly. And it doesn't mean that it could be that their life is better in other ways. For example, they've got access to more diversity. It's more likely that their tastes can be quite accurately met by some of the cultural things in the city. It's more likely they can find employment. But it's also more likely they can find employment. And it could be that there are many things that are worse as well as some things that are better. And it's not obvious how the balance seems like it's going to have to be that it's better. But that may be because employment plays such a large role. Where are you getting at with that? Do you think it's...
I just wondered if you were thinking that life in a village is very simple and not diverse, and the lack of contact and things coming in from outside, and I'm not sure that that's the case. It might be a small number there, but people come in from outside and bring in other influences, and there's a diversity amongst the talents that are within the village. So, I
agree with all
I would
that.
say that was true historically in Britain. That would be the case. I'm not sure I know very much about villages elsewhere, But historically, that would be the case.
That's right. I think the reason we're talking about villages versus cities, though, is to try to think on a smaller scale of the difference between a small population and a large population.
Yes.
And if we're imagining a large population divided into many villages versus a large population in a city, then that's not going to help our arguments because they're both large population examples. So in for this kind of thought experiment where we're thinking, why is it that a village is relevant to this argument, we're kind of imagining a village in isolation and a city in isolation. So that we end up with larger and smaller populations. Whereas if we imagine there's a village and then there's also a whole lot of other villages who do their own thing and then occasionally send things into that sort of thing.
Constraint to stop.
Yeah.
Divide the population and bring them into villages. You'd end up with a problem, I think.
Yes.
Wait, I'd like to go back to, actually now I'm interrupted, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Right. I mean, you went back right at the very beginning and made an assumption that all these things would not have been developed if we didn't have a large population. So there's a diversity of ability and bring in all these ideas. But the motivation for making these moves forward, whichever way I would suggest, with change, we use change instead of forward, is often because there's a lack of something. And it's the lack that motivates you to find another way of doing it. So there was a lack of people to plough the land. So what do? We have to get better tools. And it's always looking for better tools to take the place of people that's actually motivated the enormous changes that were made in Europe. And it's since those changes and the way in which we conceived of things that then we actually began to improve health and welfare and things like that, and then the population went on. So I can only talk about Europe, I can't talk about
so that's a really interesting point. It connects to what you were saying earlier. So what I was thinking here at the very kind of abstract high level is that if you only have half as many people, then half the people who are going to invent something good don't get to do it. So, take the world at the moment and look at all of the people. So there's only a 50% chance we have Elon Musk, or only a 50% chance we have Steve Jobs, or whatever, if we only had half as many people. So you're going to lose a lot of the inventors, and then presumably, if these people are all free riding, then there's going to be less invented. However, that's at one very abstract level. But then you're pointing out that if it's the case that one of the main drivers for invention is something to do with, say, lack of population, then that driver might increase. So it wouldn't be the case. I was kind of imagining other things being equal, whereas that's one way in which other things wouldn't be equal. So you could get this driver. Whether that driver would be strong enough to kind of overwhelm the other effect is an interesting question. But you're right that I spoke too strongly when I said that there would be less invention if there were fewer people. There's at least one obvious reason why there'd be less invention if there were fewer people, which is there'd be fewer people to invent things. But you're saying that there's also some reasons why there might be more invention if there were fewer people, and one would want to know how those things empirically interact. There is some literature on this. For example, there was more invention. The standard stuff, I think, in endogenous growth theory. Maybe as our economist, you might be able to help me out here. But I think standard results are that larger populations had higher rates of growth and also higher rates of technological attainment historically. And that doesn't seem to fit so well with the story that it was a lack that did it. It looks like the size overwhelmed the other thing.
It's probably a critical bit, isn't there? There's a critical size. You need to be a certain size, but if you get too low, as you say, you then go to extinction.
So definitely there's some kind of critical size for extinction. Whether there's a critical size for technological development or whether it's a continuum, it seems more plausible to me that it would be a continuum. But it could be the case that it goes up for a while, then starts to come down again, and that's plausible. Often when we think why is it that, say, the Fijian islanders didn't invent nuclear weapons or something? We'd say, well, there weren't enough of them.
They're sitting nicely in the sunshine, and why bother? Because it's fish in the sea, and they can
but at least intuitive, we could replace them with the Inuit if we like in this example. But it's if we ask ourselves, why it is that technologies were invented in certain places and not others. One of the things that often occurs to us is that there were relatively few people and so on. We tend to have this idea that you're more likely to invent things if there was kind of a larger community. That said, the drivers for invention also include things like war, which we think is pretty bad. So that's one reason why there was, as far as I understand, why there was so much technological development in Europe. So it's not just the case that we should ramp up all the drivers. I'm just trying to say that that's one kind of benefit, and we should weigh that against the cost.
Comment on this?
By far the most important transition through inventions that we made in the world was the Industrial Revolution that started in this country in about 1750, roughly, let's say. In 1800, there were only 3 cities in the world with over 1 million people: London, Beijing, and Tokyo. And yet, in those smaller cities in the north, the steam engine and industrialization and steelworks and metallurgy and all sorts of things emerged. And they've done more, I suggest, to transform the planet for better or worse than subsequent inventions.
So this could be right. I'm not industrial.
The concomitant figures are, in 1800 there are 3 cities with over 1 billion. 1900 there are, I think, 19 cities with over 1 billion. New York, Paris, and so on, Berlin. And in today, 2000, there are about 443.
Okay, so I'm not an Industrial Revolution scholar by any means, but as far as I understand, in I think Highbridge, where it started, there was it was a particular aspect where there was coal and iron ore located very near to each other, and also I think a water source, and this was why it was, well, at least thought to be a major reason why it was in that particular location. That things really got started because they actually had the natural resources needed. So I'm not exactly sure about the kind of claiming why that didn't happen in London being a kind of good explanation as to why population isn't useful for such a thing. It seems that if we'd had half as many people, we'd have half the chance that there were people settled in Highbridge.
And then getting into the realms of the development of capitalism, and capitalism then drives in a different direction, doesn't it? So there's a great big market in London, so if we're living in Highbridge, we can make the rails and then put them on.
That's a good point.
The metal or whatever.
That's a good point.
Actually, they boil stuff in London, make beer and that kind of thing. So you have to make great big vats and stuff and ship it out. So you're actually introducing a new motivation here, which
that's right, actually.
Is capitalism.
But it's, I mean, your point is quite interesting because it shows 2 sides of this kind of high population producing potentially more technologies. One is the supply side story, where you say, because there's more people to supply it. There's more inventors, there's more, and I was kind of focusing on that. But it's also the case that if there's more people, there's more consumers. And so there's more people demanding boiling and so on, which can then make it worth kind of building an industrial plant in order to produce these objects and then send them to London. And similarly, that's part of the story with information goods, that because there's such a large market, it can be worth me making a really niche application, which is very useful, say, to biologists. Whereas if there were far fewer people in the world, it wouldn't be worth me making that niche application because they wouldn't be able to get the money for it. So that's both the demand and the supply are both ways in which it can promote more technological or cultural development if you have a larger population.
You've been waiting patiently.
Oh, yeah, okay. So I had a question about, I know you thought a lot about giving to charity and which charities are more effective than others. And I'm wondering if I'm considering between, say, giving to a malaria charity where the effect would be someone's life gets extended, or giving to a deworming charity where the effect wouldn't be that anyone's life gets extended but their quality of life improves. If there's some population consideration here or about some consideration about resource conservation. So I might think I should give to the deworming charity because if I gave to the malaria charity, there would be someone in the future who would be using up resources, and maybe those resources would be used more efficiently by people in the future. Maybe future people are better converters of resources into happiness or well-being or something like that. So do you think this is a consideration in favor of giving to like a life-improving charity, but not a life-extending?
So it's getting into some interesting philosophy here. So in terms of global health, there's a distinction often made between extending people's lives and improving the quality of the life during the years that they're alive for. Interestingly, while that's not normally the type of thing that people talk about when they're thinking about population, they tend to be thinking about whether to have new births or not to have new births. The instantaneous population, so the population at a time, you say the population tomorrow will be higher if say, my mother stays alive than if she doesn't stay alive. And so life extension questions are also related to population, via the death rate. And this does mean that if one thought that the world was overpopulated, such that it was bad to have such a high population at any one time, then it ends up being, compared to if you thought it was underpopulated, it ends up being slightly less bad when people die. So years of extension turn out to matter less than they would if we thought that it was underpopulated. And so in terms of that they balance things when they're doing the global health stuff, such that there's a certain technique they use, kind of economics technique, in order to balance what they mean by a given size of improvement to the quality of life versus to the quantity of life, to extend lives. But you could tweak that, and you could put like a parameter on there where you make one count for less. It turns out one person in this room has written at least a draft paper on that topic, which is Hillary. So she'll be the person to talk to. But I think that something like that is plausible, that these years of life extension might be less important than quality improvements because of this issue. There are extra complicating factors, though, because it's an unknown empirical question as to whether if you save lives that's mainly life extension is for very young children, and whether if you save lives of young children that leads to more higher population or a lower population. Because it's one of the things in the demographic transition, and it's unknown what causes what. But at least some people think that if we were to lower infant mortality, then it would temporarily lead to a larger number of people, but in the longer run it would lead to a smaller number of people. And there are some good arguments for that, but it's also controversial empirically. So ultimately, it's hard to say at the moment.
Thanks.
I would be interested if we just have a kind of quick guess as to, what do people think that the a kind of ideal population would be? Modulo our concerns earlier about it matters where the people are and so on, and it's not necessarily the same. If it was just as a number.
You dismissed the idea of an optimal population, which we regard as a very important concept. It doesn't have a number attached, but it would be defined as that number of people where all can have the, quotes, best, unquote, quality of life within planetary boundaries.
Okay.
And what the best quality of life is, and particularly how much resource consumption per head is entailed in that, critically affects the number of people that could be sustained at such a level.
Okay.
And for instance, if your idea of the best life does involve a private jet and 3 big villas, then the Earth can sustain very few people within planetary boundaries. If, on the other hand, in my case, we brought up in the 40s and 50s under rationing, a very, very happy childhood, a healthy childhood, you're content to put up with the standard of living that we put up with then, you can have much larger.
So I should say I wasn't trying to dismiss the idea of. I was tempted to call the talk optimal population. But one downside with it is if people are going to consume resources in an unegalitarian way, then it's not clear that we can just have one number. If you're trying to define the number via what would be the ideal population if we did consume resources in an egalitarian way, then you kind of get a number, although it's less clear that number is exactly relevant, because if as it happens we won't consume in an egalitarian way, then maybe that lowers the ideal number, given that we're going to be in egalitarian about it.
Critically, on a qualitative, subjective judgment about how much stuff we need to carry these lives.
Yeah, and so I completely agree with that, and I kind of mentioned there's extra slides about different types of limits that in practice they're not sharp cutoffs, but reach points of rapidly increasing costs is kind of how they work. It's not that you just literally couldn't add another person to the population, it's that if you added them, life would get a lot worse for other people. And then I asked this question, are we near a limit on food production? And to some extent, the answer is yes. We can only just feed the current population and have little arable land left to expand. However, to some extent, the answer is no, because meat production uses much more land per eater than vegetables, so we could support twice as many people if we ate less meat. In terms of food, that is. So the food limit, I call this a soft limit. So we're near a certain type of limit, which is, given our current rather atrocious behaviour, we can't have many more people on this measure. If we had much better behaviour, then we could have more. And I think that it's interesting to keep track of both the soft and the hard limits, because the soft limits, if we were able to transform society to act in a kind of ideal way, the soft limits wouldn't really matter. We'd just worry about the hard limits. But in practice, they do matter, because we know it's difficult to transform people's meat-eating consumption, for example. Although it does raise this interesting question as to whether this is a case of overpopulation or overconsumption, because there are two ways to look at it. You could say, well, we could have a lot more people if we all consumed a lot less. And should we blame population or should we blame consumption? And my tendency there is to blame consumption. But I very much agree with your point that we could have better lives for any given population size if we were all much fairer about how we kind of lived in the world and so on. And that we should push for that, as well as potentially pushing for a lower population.
Natalie Shedd, I saw the head of the Green Party, I saw on my screen last night and earlier this week, saying there is no such thing as a population problem. If we all consumed at the same level as Ethiopians, the planet could take lots more of us. Which is a very funny way, because she's not putting in her manifesto, and you're going to reduce your consumption within power to shoot down an Ethiopian. So I challenge the critics, and she fashion the politician, but it was
That is a funny observation. I mean, also, I would say that we could have quality of life actually very similar to our current quality of life. As it happens, in another life, I advocate donating a large proportion of one's income to fighting global poverty in cost-effective ways. And so I donate about a third of my income, and this has almost no effect on my quality of life. It just turns out that the things that have the large effect on quality of life, beyond a certain point, are not monetary related. So I'm a big believer in consuming less and using that in order to help people more around the world.
Okay, well, that's out of time for the official session. So
great.
Thanks very much, Toby.
Thanks. Yeah, when we have coffee, I'd be interested in people do give me impromptu answers to like your best guesses for the ideal population.
We changed our name from Population Trust to Population Matters simply because whenever I hear on the news programme, they say, give us a number.
Okay, I'll do this. You do the other thing.